Okay, so I'm going to split this lecture up into two different sections for tonight. I'm going to start with Africans in America because this is something I didn't get to finish talking about in class. And so just wanted to mention a couple things that were fairly important here. First off, what we're going to see is, of course, the slave trade is going to become one of the dominant kind of drives to bring slaves in terms of like economic necessity. The climate is going to be really bad in the South, and as we saw, slaves seem to be better acclimated to the heat, the humidity, and the malaria-carrying mosquitoes. But that doesn't mean it's any less deadly for them. The labor is going to be very difficult. Many a slave is going to die due to the poor working conditions. And working on rice and indigo plantations was especially difficult simply because it was hot and humid. You were working in, water, so your feet were constantly soaked, and of course mosquitoes kind of buzzing around in these kind of stagnant bodies of water. In the tobacco plantations, in the Chesapeake, the work was not as hard. It was still hard for sure, but you at least were closer, whereas the rice plantations were very spread out, so you didn't really have interaction with other slaves. And in the Chesapeake, on the Sundays, which was usually the one day of rest, the slaves could kind of actually go to other plantations, and you might even have family members who are on other plantations, and so you could go kind of mingle with them. The other thing, too, was that as the population of female slaves goes up, you start to see slaves have families. Now, of course, the drawback of this is, when you had children, they were also born into slavery. You do see the number of slaves in the North grow, but not nearly to the levels that you have in the South. One of the things that's kind of unique, if you've ever gone to South Carolina or to Charleston, you've probably experienced Gullah culture. The Boone Hall Plantation, they have a really good Gullah presentation that they do. It's really informative. And what you'll see are that some of these slaves develop their own kind of mixed cultures. You have to remember it's a mixture of African American elements of speech, religion, folkways, and they develop a unique language called Gullah, and most likely in South Carolina. And it's probably a combination of Angolan, which is from Africa, and it also blends English and then a couple other African languages, mainly because, remember, these are slaves that have come from different places in Africa. And so there's a lot of different things that will be incorporated into that, like voodoo is a Gullah word for witchcraft, gumbo for okra. And so you'll start to see this kind of unique African slave culture develop that has obviously a lasting impact. The fact that you can still go to South Carolina and some people still speak Gullah. You'll also have slaves who will have some sort of set skills, carpenters, bricklayers, tanners, which obviously meant that you were useful and probably a little better off than those working out in the fields. You also had manual laborers who were clearing and draining swamps, and that was probably some of the worst type of work that you could do. There are going to be some examples of early resistance to slavery. For example, in 1712, there's going to be a New York slave revolt, and this is going to kill 9 white people, and basically you'll have 21 blacks who will be executed as kind of almost like a example to the other slaves, like this is what happens. You'll also have what's called the South Carolina Slave Revolt, or the Stono Revolt, or Stono Rebellion. And this is in 1739, and what happens is 50 blacks who are along the Stono River, they decide that they're going to try to get to Florida, which at the time is controlled by Spain. And they're hoping that they can get to Spain, and Spain at the time was actually taking slaves, and basically they were, freeing them, but they were also giving them, weapons and clothing and food and shelter. in hopes that it would increase their numbers to kind of thwart English colonization. What will happen is they'll be stopped by a militia in South Carolina, and they will execute some of them. And actually, they'll end up putting some of their heads on pikes as an example, again, to people, like kind of what happens when you revolt. Okay, the other thing that we're looking at here is the structure of colonial society. And what you're going to see here is that, with the exception of slavery, in the colonies, the idea of, kind of coming and starting from the bottom, you could actually work your way up. There was stratification. You'll see particularly wealthy merchants in some of the larger cities, especially along the coast, in New England and the middle colonies. You'll also see the super wealthy plantation owners in the South, kind of above everybody else. And the wars between natives and French and Spanish will also leave widows and orphans abound, and of course for them they really won't have a whole lot of opportunities to kind of move up, and so war is going to play a big role into that. The other thing that you're going to see here is that land is going to be less available. We talked about this a little bit in class. Farms are going to get smaller. Younger children are going to be hired out as wage laborers because, if you made your living selling tobacco or something like that, but then you didn't have any more land to grow more tobacco, your kids would be hired out to basically be paid wages, and that would kind of go towards your family income. And also the amount of homeless poor in the city of Boston will also increase, and a lot of them will be kind of cared for by public charities. In the South, you're probably going to see more stratification than you do anywhere else. Basically, what you end up having are these really large slave owners who own these gigantic plantations, and there will be the group known as the poor whites. And the poor whites, who are mostly tenant farmers, meaning they don't even own the land. They're working on land that they're basically paying off these plantation owners with. These people will be treated pretty poorly, almost as bad as slaves, but the fact that they're white is what kind of elevated them above the status of slavery, but they were pretty much enduring their own sort of slavery. The other thing is that these indentured servants that we've discussed, the numbers of indentured servants for a while there was fairly large, but what you see is that not all of them end up kind of getting that land that they had been promised. So you have some indentured servants who end up kind of in that poor class, though a lot of them end up kind of doing well, and indentured servitude does work out for them in the end, even though it was pretty brutal. The other thing are they call them the jailbirds, and these were people who were shipped forcefully to the New World, and they were robbers, rapists, murderers, and these people, of course, didn't really care for the British government, and so you're going to have a lot of people who probably shouldn't be there in the colonies, not necessarily good people who are there. And of course, at the very bottom were blacks, who had essentially no equality with whites. They were oppressed in almost every way you could think. And you have whites, particularly in South Carolina in 1760, and they are starting to get actually kind of freaked out because they realize that they are outnumbered. And they're concerned that if these slaves decide one day to kind of rise up as a whole, there's not a whole lot that they could do to stop them. You're also going to have the British authorities who are going to try to keep the slave trade going for as long as possible, simply because they saw it as a cheap supply of labor, especially in the West Indies on the sugar plantations. And so a lot of the British members in Parliament will veto efforts to stop the slave trade for quite a long time. And we'll talk about this later when we get to Thomas Jefferson. There's a lot of complexity about morality here. You might have morally disagreed with it, but your livelihood depended on it, and so it was very frustrating for some people to see, how do we get rid of this? But then if we get rid of it, say bye-bye to your jobs, to your economy. Also, professions. Christian ministry, so being like a pastor, was considered to be one of the more upstanding jobs in the colonies. But by 1775, ministers are kind of on the decline. Physicians at the time were also very poorly trained. A lot of times the physician was your barber, essentially. But then in 1765, you see the opening of the first medical school and an attempt to try and actually train these people, so that way you have professionals. You got to think about the medical practices at the time, like bleeding, which they think is one of the ways that potentially led to George Washington being killed, which was, if someone was sick, you thought the disease was in the blood, so you bled them into like a bowl. But of course, what you were doing was you were just cutting off their blood supply, like you were removing blood from their body, making them weaker. And lawyers were also, like guys like John Adams, were also not particularly looked well upon. Lawyers were seen as, kind of troublemakers. They liked to talk, and basically were in it for profit. But eventually that will start to change as well. Most people were still farmers, about 90%. Tobacco was the main crop of Maryland and Virginia. The middle colonies produced a great deal of grain, winning them the name bread colonies. New York, I think, alone exported like 80,000 barrels of flour a year. Overall, even though you were a farmer, as an American, you still had a higher standard of living than pretty much any other country at the time. In terms of, you had more to eat, you had probably a nicer home, a bigger family, a healthier lifestyle. Fishing was also a very popular trade, particularly in New England, which sent tons of fish to Catholic countries in Europe, because at that time, if you were Catholic, you essentially ate fish on Fridays, no meat. And you also had the ability to work in commerce, so either along the coast or overseas. And basically, this could have been land speculation. It could have been, charging or having your own dock and like shipping company. Just kind of depended on what you were good at. The triangular trade, which we talked about, was also very profitable. I'm not going to talk too much about it since we've already discussed it, but just make sure you're familiar with it and what goes in what direction. The other thing, too, is manufacturing was of secondary importance in the colonies, because most of the primary manufacturing at the time was being done in England, though we'll see this change. What was more common was what was called household manufacturing, which was essentially people who worked in their homes, particularly women who did spinning and weaving, and they sold things out of their home. Skilled craftspeople weren't particularly common. Generally, the types of things that you did were you might be a carpenter, or you might be manufacturing rum, which a lot of people paid high money for. It just kind of depended. Probably one of the biggest things that you see, especially coming out of New England, were lumber and then what we call naval stores. And naval stores was tar, pitch, rosin, turpentine, and all of these items were necessary to build ships, which Britain had a huge concentration on because they wanted to maintain a very powerful navy. And so these were huge exports out to Europe, but mainly England, so they could continue to build ships. In the 1730s, though, you'll start to see an imbalance in trade. Americans demanded more and more British products, but the British population, basically, they can't take any more American imports. I mean, they've pretty much purchased as much as they can. And so what you end up having here is, how can colonists sell goods to make money to buy what they want in Britain if British people are not going to be buying it? Well, the obvious answer is, let's sell to non-British people. And of course, this is going to become a problem, as we've kind of discussed. And what Britain does here is they pass what's called the Molasses Act. And basically what they're trying to do with this is they want to try and limit trade with the French West Indies. And the goal here, of course, is to try and keep that trade exclusive just with them. And Americans will respond with smuggling, and of course what we're going to see is this will lead to a huge problem because Parliament will want to control this trade, and Americans decide that, you know what, if it's going to come down to it, we would rather revolt and fight against you and get rid of you so that way we can trade with whomever we want.